I'm Noah, 33, and I've got a younger brother Liam, who's 29. Our dad, Mark, now 57, raised us after my mom passed away when we were still in middle school. Growing up, it was clear my dad always favored Liam. I think it was because we were so different. While Dad was all about sports and manly activities, I was more into things like cooking, reading, and music. I was definitely more of a mama's boy. Dad tried to get me into football, but it just wasn't my thing. I was clumsy, and to be honest, I just didn't care about it. Liam, though, was the complete opposite. He was everything Dad wanted in a son. Athletic, rough and tumble, always up for a game or getting his hands dirty. It was obvious to everyone that Dad loved Liam way more than me. He'd go on and on about Liam's achievements, but when it came to me, he had nothing to say. My mom, on the other hand, was different. She never played favorites, and I guess that's why I was so close to her. I tried to connect with Dad, especially after my mom got sick, but he didn't seem interested. When my mom died from cancer during my 8th grade year, it hit me harder than I can even describe. She was my anchor, and losing her felt like my whole world was falling apart. While Dad and Liam seemed to shut off their emotions, I spiraled. My only comfort came from the kitchen, where I spent every free moment cooking, something my mom had taught me and something that reminded me of her. Dad didn't understand my love for cooking. In fact, it seemed to make him madder. He'd tell me to stop wasting time in the kitchen and do something manly, like Liam. One day, he'd had enough and threatened that if he caught me cooking again, he'd make me do all the household chores. He told me to man up and be more like my brother. That turned into one of the biggest arguments we ever had. I told him he never loved me, and to my shock, he didn't even deny it. That was the last time I tried to mend things with him. From then on, I spent most of my time alone, focused on cooking and my studies. I stopped caring about what Dad thought, but deep down, the rejection still hurt. Liam didn't care about me either. He followed Dad's lead, and soon I found myself completely isolated. The house that once felt like home became a place I couldn't stand being in. The only reason I didn't move out sooner was because I wanted to stay in the same school, and the thought of leaving the place where I had my last memories of my mom was too painful. When it came time to apply to colleges, I set my sights on culinary school. I'd been secretly interning at a restaurant that summer, getting experience, and even managed to get a recommendation letter from the chef there. I applied to a few top culinary programs and regular colleges just in case. To my surprise, I got into one of the best culinary schools in France. I was thrilled, but I knew asking my dad for help with the tuition would be tough. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask, I was ready for him to mock my career choice. But nothing could have prepared me for his response. He didn't just dismiss my interest in culinary school, he refused to pay for my education at all. His excuse? He didn't want me making Liam feel insecure. Liam had been struggling in school and wasn't doing well, so Dad wanted me to either go to a community college or figure out how to pay for it myself. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dad had the money. He wasn't struggling by any means, but he wasn't willing to support my dreams because he didn't want Liam to feel overshadowed. It was devastating. I begged, pleaded, and even cried, but Dad wouldn't budge. He made it clear that Liam's well-being was his top priority and that he didn't want any competition between us. In that moment, I knew I'd never have his support. We had a massive fight, one that ended with me packing my things and leaving the house for good. I moved in with my aunt, Emma, who was my mom's older sister. She was the only family I had left who cared about me. I told her everything that had happened, and she was as outraged as I was. Even though she wasn't as well off as my dad, she promised to help me in any way she could. Somehow, she managed to scrape together the money with the help of her friends, and I was able to go to the culinary school in France. I will always be grateful to her for that. Once I got to France, I worked part-time to cover as many of my expenses as I could and threw myself into my studies. I wanted to prove to myself and to my mom that I could make it. I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life, and by the time I graduated, I was one of the top chefs in my class. I landed a job at a prestigious French restaurant shortly after graduation and started sending part of my salary back to my aunt as a way to repay her. It took time, but I was determined to make it up to her. I spent a few years working in France, saving up every penny I could. Eventually, I had enough to move back home and open up my own restaurant. It was a dream come true. Two of my closest friends from culinary school even decided to partner with me on the venture. We found the perfect location, and the restaurant was set to open in a few weeks. I decided to name it after my mom, and thankfully, my partners were on board with the idea. Everything was finally falling into place. The restaurant's opening was a huge milestone for me. After years of hard work, I was finally about to show the world what I was capable of. We planned a small private gathering to celebrate the opening before going fully public. I invited my Aunt Emma, a few of her friends who helped pay for my tuition, and some old friends from school. It wasn't going to be a big event, just something intimate to mark the occasion. I didn't invite my dad or Liam, obviously. I hadn't spoken to either of them since I left home, and as far as I was concerned, it was better that way. The night before the event, I was at the restaurant making sure everything was perfect. My partners were just as excited as I was, and we were going over last-minute details when, out of nowhere, my dad and Liam showed up. They walked right into the restaurant like nothing bad had ever happened between us, all smiles and warmth, as if we were some happy family. I was completely caught off guard. My heart dropped when I saw them, and for a second I didn't even know how to react. They greeted me with big hugs, which felt incredibly awkward. It was like we were playing some twisted game of pretending. My partners, who didn't know the full backstory, greeted them politely and then gave us some space, sensing my discomfort. Once we were alone, my dad pulled out a gift. Of all things, it was a portrait of my mom. He said he'd commissioned it for me to hang in the restaurant as a way to honor her. He claimed that when he heard about a new restaurant with my mom's name opening in the city, he just knew it had to be me. For the first time in years, I saw my dad acting proud of me, telling me he always knew I had it in me. Liam chimed in too, saying how proud he was of what I'd accomplished. The whole thing felt surreal. I wanted to believe that they were genuine, but deep down, I knew something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this sudden act of kindness. Sure enough, after a few minutes of small talk, they finally got to the real reason they were there. Liam had been struggling. He wasn't doing well professionally. Apparently, he was working as a bartender, and even that job was thanks to a favor my dad had pulled. Liam's grades had tanked in high school and college, and he'd never gotten the scholarships or high-paying jobs my dad had always imagined for him. In the end, he'd gone to community college, which was ironic considering Dad had pushed me in that direction to avoid overshadowing him. And now, they wanted me to make Liam a partner in the restaurant. They thought that giving him a respectable position would help him get back on his feet. I had to hold back from laughing in their faces. They had the nerve to show up after years of ignoring me and then ask for a favor, like I owed them something. But instead of causing a scene, I stayed calm and told them I'd think about it. Of course, I had no intention of making Liam a partner. He hadn't earned it, and he certainly didn't deserve it. But I didn't want to kick them out just yet. I had a different plan in mind. The next day, the party went off without a hitch. Our guests arrived, and I spent the evening mingling, smiling, and showing everyone around the restaurant. My dad and Liam were there too, acting like proud family members, talking to guests, and boasting about my accomplishments as if they had been supportive all along. I marveled at their audacity, but I played along, waiting for the right moment to set things straight. Towards the end of the night, it was time for me and my partners to give our speeches. I let my friends go first, and then it was finally my turn. I raised my glass and thanked everyone for coming. I started by honoring my mom, the one person who had always believed in me, even when no one else did. I told the guests how it was her love and support that inspired me to follow my dreams, and I dedicated the success of the restaurant to her memory. After that, I shifted gears. I decided it was time to speak my truth. I told everyone how I'd had to borrow money from my aunt and her friends just to attend culinary school, and I thanked them publicly for their generosity. Then, I explained why I needed that loan in the first place, because my own father had refused to support me. I shared how growing up, I was never the son my dad wanted, how he had always preferred Liam, and how he had turned his back on me when I needed him the most. I made it clear that my dad had chosen Liam's well-being over my dreams, and that's why I left home. Despite everything, I managed to succeed, And in a twisted way, I owed part of that success to the hardships they'd put me through. The guests were visibly shocked, and I could see people giving my dad and Liam nasty looks as I spoke. My dad and Liam stood there in silence, clearly uncomfortable, but they couldn't leave without making a scene. To wrap things up, I walked over to them, hugged them both, and thanked them for coming. I even made a grand gesture, saying I'd forgiven them for everything in the past, and that I'd give Liam a job at the restaurant, not as a partner, but as a bartender. The room erupted in applause, and to anyone watching, it looked like a heartfelt family reconciliation. But only the three of us knew the truth. It was my way of humiliating them, just like they'd humiliated me all those years. They had no choice but to smile and act grateful, even though I knew they were furious inside. They couldn't afford to storm out and make a scene in front of everyone, which made the moment even more satisfying. I'd played their game and won. After the party, once most of the guests had left, my dad and Liam confronted me outside the restaurant. They were livid. Liam was on the verge of tears, and my dad demanded to know why I had humiliated them like that. He said if I had no intention of making Liam a partner, I should have just turned them away when they first showed up. I couldn't help but laugh. I told them this was my way of paying them back for everything they'd put me through. They deserved it. I walked away without looking back, even when I heard Liam crying, calling me cruel, and Dad shouting that I'd regret what I'd done. But I didn't care. I got in my car and drove off, leaving them behind in the dust. A couple of days passed, and I hadn't heard a word from my dad or Liam since that night. I wasn't surprised. I figured they needed some time to stew over what had happened. My Aunt Emma, though, thought I'd gone too far. She told me I should have just turned them away at the door instead of humiliating them in front of everyone. But I didn't agree with her. They had hurt me for years, and this was their comeuppance. I wasn't about to apologize for that. Still, I understood where my aunt was coming from. She's the kind of person who believes in keeping peace no matter what. But I wasn't ready to let things go. I explained to her that my dad and Liam had their chance to apologize when they showed up, but they didn't. Instead, they tried to take advantage of me, like always. After hearing that, she dropped the subject, and we agreed to disagree. I was fine with that. I had too much going on with the restaurant to dwell on it anyway. Things were starting to pick up at the restaurant. Word was spreading, and we were getting more and more reservations. It was an exciting time for me, but just when I thought I could focus on my work and move on from the drama, Liam started causing more problems. It began with rumors. Some old high school friends reached out to me, saying they'd heard I had kicked my dad and brother out of the restaurant after humiliating them and feeding them stale food. Apparently, Liam had been going around telling people I treated them horribly that night. Of course, none of it was true, but he was trying to paint me as the villain. At first, I didn't care. I wasn't going to waste my energy on high school gossip. But then I realized that these rumors could affect my business. I couldn't afford for people to think I treated my family badly or that I ran a lousy restaurant. So I decided to confront Liam directly. I texted him, telling him to cut it out. I made it clear that if he kept spreading lies, I'd make sure he lost his job at the bar he was working at. I hoped that would be enough to make him stop, but instead, he doubled down. He texted me back, saying he'd only stop if I made him a partner in the restaurant. I couldn't believe his audacity. He thought blackmailing me was going to work. It was beyond stupid, and honestly, I wasn't even angry at this point. I was just tired. Tired of Liam thinking he could manipulate me. Tired of Dad thinking he could swoop in and control my life. I'd worked too hard to let them drag me back down. I wasn't going to let them win. I told Liam that if he didn't stop, he'd be hearing from my lawyer. I had no intention of actually getting lawyers involved unless I absolutely had to, but I wanted him to know I wasn't playing games anymore. This was my last warning to him. I was done with the nonsense. To my surprise, the threats worked. Liam stopped spreading rumors, at least for the time being. But I knew that wasn't the end of it. He was desperate, and desperate people always find a way to cause trouble. A few weeks later, they did just that. It was a busy night at the restaurant. We'd been open for a couple of months by then, and things were going great. I was in the kitchen overseeing everything when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my dad. He said he and Liam were on their way to see me and that we needed to talk. I didn't even have time to process the message before they showed up at the restaurant. They didn't come to eat or chat. They came to threaten me. Dad said they'd spoken to a lawyer and were planning to sue me for using my mother's name for the restaurant. They claimed I didn't have the right to name it after her without their permission. I could see right through them, though. This wasn't about the name. It was just another ploy to pressure me into making Liam a partner. I called their bluff immediately. I knew there wasn't a lawyer in the world who would take up a case like that. My mom was my mother too, not just my dad's wife, and no one could stop me from honoring her the way I wanted. The threat was empty, and they both knew it. But the fact that they would stoop that low, using my mom's memory as leverage, was a new low, even for them. I told them to leave me alone, once and for all. I didn't raise my voice, but I was firm. This was their last warning. If they didn't back off, I would have no choice but to take legal action myself. That was when things got ugly. Liam lost it. He grabbed me by the collar, his face red with anger. I could see years of frustration boiling over in his eyes. It wasn't just about the restaurant, it was about the fact that I had succeeded where he had failed. I could feel the weight of all the jealousy and resentment he'd been carrying, and now he was finally letting it out. Before things could escalate, Dad stepped in and pulled him back. He told Liam to wait outside, then turned to me. His tone changed. He was no longer the angry, threatening man who'd just been trying to sue me. Instead, he tried to play on my emotions, telling me that if my mom could see how I was treating them, she'd be heartbroken. That was the last straw for me. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him that using my mother's name to manipulate me was unforgivable. I wasn't going to let him twist her memory to suit his own agenda. I reminded him that he was the one who had refused to pay for my education when I needed him most. He had never supported me or believed in me, and he had no right to tell me how my mom would feel about anything. At that point, I was done. I told him to get out and not to come back. This was the final chapter in our relationship, and I wasn't looking for any reconciliation. I had given them more chances than they deserved, and all they'd done was take advantage of me every single time. They left, and I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I realized I didn't need their approval. I didn't need them in my life at all. I had built something incredible without them, and nothing they did or said could take that away from me. My restaurant was thriving, my team was like family, and I had my Aunt Emma, who had always believed in me. After they left, I stood in the empty kitchen for a while, just thinking. I knew things would never be the same again, but honestly, that was fine with me. I had finally cut the last tie that had been holding me back, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It's been about a month since that final confrontation with my dad and Liam. I haven't heard from either of them since. I thought that after all the drama, they would have finally realized I was serious about cutting them out of my life, but I should have known better. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from my Aunt Emma. She had heard from one of her friends that my dad and Liam were going around telling people that I had stolen the family name to build my restaurant, and that they were planning to sue me for it. It was ridiculous, of course, but the fact that they were still trying to undermine me after everything really got under my skin. I decided it was time to put an end to it, once and for all. I wasn't going to let them keep dragging my name, and my mother's name, through the mud. I talked to my lawyer, just to be prepared in case they actually tried to make good on their threats, but even he reassured me that they didn't have a leg to stand on. My mom was my mother too, and there was no law preventing me from using her name in a way that honored her memory. Still, I was tired of playing defense. I wanted to go on the offensive for once. So I made a public statement through the restaurant's social media accounts, explaining the meaning behind the name of the restaurant and how it was a tribute to my late mother. I didn't mention my dad or Liam by name, but I made it clear that this was a deeply personal project and that I wouldn't tolerate anyone trying to tarnish my mom's memory. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Customers, old friends, and even people I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to say how much they admired what I had built and how proud my mom would have been. It felt like I had finally turned the corner and was fully in control of my own story. After that, things settled down. Business was booming, and the restaurant was getting great reviews. I threw myself into the work, constantly thinking of ways to improve the menu, refine the atmosphere, and grow the business. It felt good to focus on something positive again, something that I loved. The drama with my family felt like a distant memory, just something I'd survived on my way to better things. But then Liam reappeared. He didn't show up at the restaurant this time. Instead, he texted me out of nowhere. I hadn't heard from him since that night when he tried to grab me, so I was surprised to see his name pop up on my phone. The message wasn't long, just a few lines, but it caught me off guard. He said he was sorry, that he realized how badly he and Dad had treated me, and that he wanted to make things right. For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me had been waiting for years to hear something like this from him, a real apology. But another part of me was skeptical. Could he really have changed so much in such a short time? Or was this just another one of his manipulative tactics to get something out of me? I didn't respond right away. I wanted to think it through, and I didn't want to make a decision I'd regret. I called Aunt Emma and told her about the message. She was cautious too. She knew how much I had been hurt in the past and didn't want me to fall into the same trap again. But at the same time, she reminded me that people can change, and maybe Liam was genuinely trying to make amends. After a few days of mulling it over, I decided to give him a chance. I agreed to meet him for coffee at a quiet cafe, just to hear him out. When I saw him again, he looked different, tired, maybe even humbled. He didn't waste time with small talk. He apologized right away, admitting that he had been jealous of me for years and had taken Dad's side because it was easier than facing his own failures. He said he regretted how he treated me and that he'd been doing a lot of thinking since our last encounter. I listened, but I didn't jump in to forgive him immediately. I needed to see if he was really sincere, so I asked him what brought about this sudden change. He told me that after our confrontation, he'd lost his job at the bar. His temper had gotten the best of him again, and he had lashed out at his boss, just like he had with me. He realized that he'd been blaming everyone else for his problems when, in reality, he was the one who needed to change. He said he'd started therapy and was trying to turn his life around. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the brother I'd always wanted, someone who could own up to his mistakes and try to be better. But even then, I wasn't ready to fully trust him. I told him that while I appreciated his apology, it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been shattered over the years. I wasn't going to just forgive him and let him back into my life without seeing real change. Liam seemed to understand that. He didn't push for anything more. He just thanked me for meeting with him and said he'd give me the space I needed, but that he was serious about wanting to fix things between us. He didn't ask about the restaurant, didn't bring up Dad. He kept the conversation focused on his own growth, which felt like a good sign. We parted on decent terms, and for the first time in years, I felt like there might be hope for some kind of relationship between us. It wouldn't happen overnight, and I wasn't going to rush it, but I was willing to see where things went. As for my dad, I haven't heard from him, and I don't expect to. Liam told me that Dad was furious after I kicked them out of the restaurant and hadn't forgiven me for it. But honestly, I don't care anymore. I spent so many years trying to get his approval, trying to be the son he wanted, but now I realize I never needed it. I've built a life that I'm proud of, and I've done it on my own terms. I don't need Dad's validation to know that I'm successful. The restaurant is thriving, and we're already talking about expanding. My partners and I are working on new ideas, and I'm excited for what's to come. My Aunt Emma is still my biggest supporter, and I make sure to visit her as often as I can. She's proud of me, and that's all that matters. In the end, I've learned that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who believe in you, and who help you rise when the world seems determined to drag you down. For me, that's been my aunt, my friends, and now my team at the restaurant. That's my real family. As for Liam, time will tell if he truly means what he says. But for now, I'm focusing on the future, on the business I've built, and the legacy I'm creating in honor of my mom. And no matter what happens, I know she would be proud of the man I've become.